when people get to that, what's the point? Particularly if you're senior or you're in a big role or you're seen to have been successful, people around you will tell you about how great your life is. So they will tell you about all the things you have, but that's not the reason why you've got to this point. The reason you've got to this point is you can't work out the why bit of the question, not the what bit.
The question is from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Paul.
Hey, I'm Ricky.
And this Question Is podcast is asking, what is the point?
What do you mean? What is the point? Why are we doing this?
Yeah, we're not going to get that deep and philosophical. This is part of a mini-series of insights from coaching that we're doing on The Question Is, where we're just going to talk about some of the questions that come up quite often when we're coaching people. When we're faced with these kind of questions, how do we respond? And what is the point actually comes up more often than you'd think. People get to this kind of slightly disillusioned, peed off state very often in their careers at some point to go, I kind of don't know why I'm here now, and I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't know if what I'm doing is going to have any value.
They kind of come across like they've lost the mojo, don't they? They go...
That's a brilliant description. Yeah, that's exactly what happens. They're slightly different. They're like, this is going to sound really nerdy. Have you ever seen Big Hero 6?
I have, yes.
Yeah, they're like him when he's slightly deflated, when he's not got enough.
Baymax.
Baymax.
Deflated.
Yeah, it's exactly how they come across. You just kind of go, right, my job here as the coach is now to pump them back up.
And often, as a coach, you kind of go, where do I go with this? Because you go, hang on a minute, you're in, typically with the people we coach, you're in a really good job.
Yeah.
You got all the trappings that come with that. Yes, you get some of the stresses and strains, but you don't get the job you've got without having some challenges day to day. But you kind of go, I don't get it. As an outsider looking in, you go, you've got everything that most people would bite your arm off for, and you're going, I just don't get it. I'm not sure I'm cut out for this anymore. I'm not sure that this is, what I want to do. And you go, really?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about this. When people get to that, what's the point? Often people struggle with a lot of the people around them. Particularly if you're senior or you're in a big role or you're seen to have been successful, that when this happens to you, people around you will tell you about how great your life is. So they will tell you about all the things you have, but that's not the reason why you've got to this point. The reason you've got to this point is you can't work out the why bit of the question, not the what bit. So it's great. I've got a great job and I'm working really hard and I get paid really well. And some people can just accept that and live with it and do really well, often because they find a purpose elsewhere in their life or they find a point outside of work. But for people who are very motivated by the work, when this happens, they are very lost. In my experience, I think there's 3 reasons why this happens, but you've probably got a couple of others, Ricky, that you've come across. I think the first one is where whatever they were working towards, the purpose, often made up purpose that they've created, has suddenly become unattainable. And the big thing I see here is where somebody goes, but I'm working to get that job, and they've now restructured and that job doesn't exist anymore, or somebody else has just been given that job, therefore I can't have it.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons. The other one is where they just don't think it's working. They're working really hard, they're doing stuff, and they're not getting any success or indicators back.
Well, so salespeople particularly suffer with some of that stuff, particularly if they've got a tough time in the marketplace, they've got a particularly strong competitor, or people don't seem to be buying into it. And guess what? If you're lacking some purpose, some reason why we do what we do, then that's going to come across in the conversations that you have.
Yeah, I had one of those. I remember one of those last year where I had a person going, but it's all not working. And so you sort of dig down and they go, well, I'm 8-10 weeks into this and I'm not selling anything. I'm doing all the right things and no one's biting and no one's selling anything. And in the middle of the coaching session, I went, what's the typical sales cycle for this stuff? And they went, about 6 months.
And they want results after 8 weeks.
Hang on a minute, whoa. And that one question made them go, "Oh, I get it now." But they were craving the results, and the lack of them was making them feel despondent, and therefore going, "What's the point?" The other one I see in this sometimes is where we need something back from other people, often the boss or our peers. We need, particularly if we're externally motivated, if we're the kind of personality that looks to the world to tell us if we're doing a good job, and sometimes the world doesn't tell us anything, doesn't tell us we're doing bad. I can think of a few leaders I've had and quite a few I've coached who only give feedback on negative things. So their view of the world is, if I'm not telling you anything,
you're doing all right.
That's my sign that you're doing you're doing all right. And you go, for some people, that's fine. But some people, that drives them particularly crazy.
But it kind of, we talk about this in a different podcast around feedback, and feedback's really important in order to help people reconnect with purpose, and purpose can come in two sides, can't it? So you've got,
Yeah.
The organizational purpose. Why are we doing this? And that will govern the decisions we make, the choices around how we approach this. But also there's the what's in it for me factor here. And I think when somebody goes, what's the point? The question is, for me, a little play on words there, look, because the question really is about, is it my purpose that's got lost, or is it I don't understand why we're doing this as an organization anymore?
Yeah, and I think that's the key. And when you're coaching somebody, when they go, what's the point? You have to kind of work out which bit have you lost here, because I could easily coach you on the wrong thing. I could easily go into, well, what can you get from this, and what's the growth in the role for you, and actually what they're talking about is my boss doesn't love me.
Yeah, or actually the only thing they ever talk about is the money, is the growth, is the profit.
Yeah.
They never talk about some of the higher meaning stuff that we're doing here, like the difference we make for our customers, or take a healthcare example for the patient experience, whatever. You go, well, hang on a minute, that helps, because that brings me back and says the reason we're doing this is to make this better for whoever that may be.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it through that line, but that's really true, isn't it? If your motivational setup, makeup is different from the people around you, it can start feeling really pointless. Because if you take the medical one or a clinical type role, because it's just really easy. Some people in those roles are very vocationally driven. They're looking at it around, how do I help people? What do I do for others? Some people in those roles are very task driven. They're very, driven by, what can I learn? How successful am I? How many patients can I treat? And there's some people in those are business driven. They're looking at it as how do I make this business work and more successful? And if you're very clinical, surrounded by a load of people who aren't really talking about outcomes in terms of patients, it must feel a bit weird after a while.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Because all of a sudden we're now really focused on what everything costs, and almost like the patient experience gets, or the perception is it drops down that pecking order,
Mm.
when actually, you know, for you as somebody in that kind of roles going, no, it's all about the patient. I kind of cost is a secondary factor.
I've experienced that in a sales team where we were selling products, and I'd come from a technical background into that sales group. Nobody else had, really. All the other technical people were not salespeople; they were technical people. So I quite liked the products and the technology and what you could do with it, and I was quite motivated by that. But none of my peers were. My peers were motivated by deal size and profit values, and you do come out of step really quickly if you feel isolated by it all.
Yeah. And I think that the key person in all of that is the manager. Because if the manager only ever talks about deal size, only ever talks about margin, only ever talks about, all of a sudden it's really quick to lose that sight that goes, hang on a minute, look at the bigger picture here. What are we trying to help this customer achieve? What are we helping our customers to address or resolve or even fix if there's a particular problem. I mean, we do lots of videos, and in a recent one, I looked at the difference between Oxfam and Coca-Cola, and even Oxfam, clear, they want to eliminate poverty, they want to remove hunger, all of those great, purposeful mission statements that you'd really want. And then you look at Coca-Cola, and everyone goes, "Well, that's a behemoth of an organization." But it's what they do with their profits in terms of their communities, in terms of investing in people around the world, particularly underprivileged people. And you go, so I can make money, and it's how we choose to use it that makes the difference. And that really surprised me because perception was very different.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that you play that down to sort of the personal level of how people turn up in work day to day. We make up most of the purpose. It's not real. If you sit, the really lowest level, if you sit and look at, somebody sitting across the office from you right now and think about why they're here, your view of it will be wrong, but actually so will theirs, because they'll have made up a reason to come in every day. That it's this whole sort of psychological contract thing that HR people talk about. They've decided they're doing it because it's all about the children, or they're doing it because they're going to do this for they're going to do this job for 2 years, and then they're going to run the department. All of that we've made up. None of it's real, and therefore, reality is going to come along at some point and bash your plans.
And then we'll put you back into, what's the point? Do they not realize how hard I've worked for 2 years?
Yeah.
And they've given the job to somebody else, or they've removed that job entirely.
But at the same time, if you kind of recognize that you made it up, it also means that you can reshape it anytime you want.
Yeah, you can reimagine a different future.
Yeah. Just finding that thing out about Coca-Cola has probably changed your imagination, your imagined perception of that organization for you, because what you thought about them before probably had very little to do with Coca-Cola, and what you thought about them now probably has very little to do with Coca-Cola, but you've got a different view because you've got a couple more facts. And I think we can do that for ourselves.
And the video was all about purpose. It was all about those elements of why is purpose so important. And actually, when you look at organizations, it's easy to have a perception that is not right.
Yes.
And when you look at the amount of money that they have invested in projects around the world to improve other people's livelihoods, or just life, when you think about some of the communities they support in Africa or less privileged areas, and you go, Oxfam are doing the same thing, but they are very clear. This is our one single mission. Coca-Cola do it by making lots of money through selling a beverage, and then play those profits elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think you sort of bring that back to the sort of an individual. When somebody sits in front of you from a coaching perspective, you go, look, when you feel like you've got to say, what is the point, is sort of running around as a question. What you're really saying is, I've lost the narrative. The one I had in my head now doesn't quite work because the world has come along and shattered it. And that might be because I'm not getting the feedback I require. It might be because I decided I was going to run this place one day and I've just worked out I'm not. It might be that you're working really hard and you can't see any successes coming back. But you can sit back and go, well, hang on, but I can change the narrative here. I can go, well, what do I want? So I'll give you an example here. One of the things I've come up quite a lot is when people have got into roles that have become difficult, or teams that have become challenging, where they're not quite sure where it's all going to go and it's all a bit messy. You go, well, actually, I think in my career, when I've been in those positions, yes, they've not been the best jobs from a point of view of it's been easy. But when I look back, they are the ones where I've grown the most and learnt the most. So it's really important when I find myself in those positions to go, right, maybe this project I'm working on isn't going to be earth-shattering. On the other hand, maybe I can reframe the point right now as a growth point for me, or a learning point for me, or I can build different relationships. I can create my own point.
I think so. So my take on what you're saying is, don't be the victim and allow external factors to control your narrative, define your narrative how you want it to be.
Yes.
Find that purpose. What makes this meaningful for you? in order to go and rediscover the point.
Yes. And if you go through that process and you go, actually, this isn't meaningful for me, that's really helpful in its own right, because then that allows you to go, well, what is? Because sometimes you might just go, you're right, there is no point to this. I'm in the wrong place.
Yes.
At which point you go, right, we'll go find the right place.
Yeah. And I think that's a real empowering state of mind that goes, you can have an adult conversation with whoever to work out how do we find the right thing for me. And that's not always about leaving the organization you're in. Most of us have worked in big organizations where other opportunities will exist. Well, let's go and carve ourselves something different then.
And it could be even in the same role you're doing now. You sit down with somebody, once you know what you want, once you know what's going to float your boat kind of thing, you sit down with your boss and they go, oh, okay, well, would you like to get involved in this? And you go, that's amazing. Thank you very much.
Yes.
You'd never have been offered it if you hadn't had the conversation. So it starts with kind of almost, and I hate this word, but kind of, what is the point can become a little bit victim-y.
Yes. And that's my point. You get a choice of being a victim or owning it.
Yeah. And owning it takes a bit of bravery, but the things you want will only come at the point you go, but I've got to go and make one or craft it or find it or discover it, because actually no one else is going to do it for me in reality.
And why should they?
I think that's an interesting point to end this podcast. Thanks, Ricky.
To find out how Thinking Focus can unlock the potential within your organization, go to www.thinkingfocus.com, where you'll discover more about the work we do, helping our clients increase productivity and enable change.